My guest today is neurologist Dr. Dale Bredesen, an expert in the mechanism of neurodegenerative diseases. He is author of the book The End of Alzheimer's, which created quite a stir when it came out. Now his latest book, The Ageless Brain, takes the conversation further. I've read his book, and he's read my latest, Alzheimer's Prevention is the Cure. So we will have a rich conversation comparing approaches and new frontiers. He is director of the Precision Brain Health Program at the Pacific Neuroscience Institute in Los Angeles. And his new book, The Ageless Brain, shows you how do you make sure you never get cognitive decline, Alzheimer's, and dementia. That's what we're going to talk about. Dale, welcome to my podcast.
Great to be here, Patrick. Thanks so much for having me.
Your excellent new book, Ageless Brain, is all about how we can bulletproof our brains. And that's the subject of our conversation. You are renowned for being the first clinician to stick your neck out with your book, An End to Alzheimer's, which honestly started a revolution, and proposing not only that Alzheimer's is preventable, which is a core theme of your new book, The Ageless Brain, but also reversible under certain conditions. So let's sort of dive in at the biggest possible hope. How late is too late in the Alzheimer's disease process? Or rather, to put it in a more positive light, what is the best case scenario that you've had of a regain in cognitive function in someone diagnosed with dementia or Alzheimer's? And how long has that benefit lasted?
Yeah, that's a great point, Patrick. And so rather than say, we think it can be here or we think there, all of this is based on outcomes from patients. We've had over 10,000 patients now go through the protocol in one way or another. We've published a successful trial back in 2022. We're now in the midst of a randomized controlled trial at 6 sites around the United States. And we've got interim analysis that it shows a statistically significant improvement with people who are on the protocol and a decline in people who are getting the standard of care for Alzheimer's disease. So let's back up for a moment and say when you develop cognitive decline, and of course, Alzheimer's is the most common cause of dementia, you go through 4 phases. You go through an asymptomatic phase. You go through a second phase, which is SCI, subjective cognitive impairment, where by definition, you know that there are some problems, but you're still able to score normally on cognitive testing. You go through a third phase, and by the way, the second phase may last 10 years on average. Third phase is called MCI, mild cognitive impairment. But as you can see, they probably chose the wrong word in mild. It's the third of 4 phases. And by definition there, you're now not doing well on cognitive testing, but you're still able to, you've preserved your activities of daily living. And then the fourth and final phase, of course, is dementia. And by definition, that means you've now begun to lose your activities of daily. So those are 4 broad phases. So let's talk about the prognosis for each based on what we've seen with all these patients. For the people who start at the asymptomatic stage, we've never had anyone progress who got on the protocol, did the right things, addressed the right things, who progressed to dementia. Maybe it'll happen someday, hasn't happened yet. The second phase, SCI, nearly 100% of the SCI people reverse their cognitive decline. And I know people will say that's impossible, you can't do that. It's time to look at this problem of cognitive decline in a completely different way. Let's not be stuck in the 20th century where we don't know what causes cognitive decline and we're going to give a medicine that doesn't work very well. That's not the way things are. That's an antiquated approach. This is what we spent so many years looking at, what actually causes the problem. So SCI, we do very well with that. MCI, in our trial, 84% of the people with MCI showed improvement. Now, some it was dramatic improvement. They went from MoCA scores of 18 to perfect 30. Others, it was less dramatic. They went from, say, 21 to 23 or something like that. But they improved at least somewhat. So most of those people we can turn around. With dementia, the fourth and final, it's harder. We've never seen anyone go from 0 MoCA to a perfect 30. We've seen them go from 0 to 9. We've seen them regain their speech, their continence, their engagement, their interaction. but we have not seen them regain everything. So the bottom line is there's a lot of reversal taking place. And we've just published the first paper recently. It's freely available online, showing people sustaining improvement for over a decade.
That's pretty amazing. And for those listening, MOCA is a cognitive function test. So if, for example, you've done the Food for the Brain cognitive function test, it's a very similar measure to that. And there's something quite interesting as well in this sort of territory, because some of the research suggests that the subjective cognitive indicators, things like, I keep losing my keys, I forget the names of people, et cetera, that if you take a group of people maybe in their 50s and 60s and ask them, do you think your memory is getting worse or not? We found that a fairly high percentage of those said, I've got no problem. When you actually do a cognitive function test, they do. And then there's a sort of, they're kind of worried, well, so no, my memory is definitely getting worse. And they do a test and they don't. And I'm not sure if you know this, but having run 400,000 cognitive function tests now, the score is decreasing almost linearly, slightly different for women than men, from the age of 18.
Yeah, it's amazing. And
Yeah.
it fits very well with this recent paper you may have seen showing changes in multiple parameters in the 20s. So that fits what you're saying very well.
So I think we're going to do a release soon, which is Alzheimer's prevention starts at age 18.
I think we have to quit thinking about this as old timers disease. And part, as you know, part of the book, The Ageless Brain, is about saying this is not just Alzheimer's, it's for all of us to save synapses. The whole point of the book is to save synapses for everybody. So we want to make it so that your brain span is as long as your lifespan. And as you know, so many people, their lifespan might be 80 or 90 or even 100, but their brain span may only be 50 or 60 or 70, and they're really having problems in the last years of their life. We can avoid that in virtually everybody now.
Well, my two core mentors, Dr. Linus Pauling, the twice Nobel Prize winner, I filmed him shortly before his death, and he was
Really?
absolutely, it was the last film made on his lipoprotein A theory. So,
Yeah.
he died of prostate cancer. He was a few months to go. And when I arrived at his beautiful place along the Big Sur coast, he was lying on his bed, had this big magnifying glass, illuminated pile of research papers. I said, I need you for about an hour. And he got up and he delivered the most eloquent. I mean, his mind was as sharp as a razor. And then my other teacher was Dr. Abram Hoffer. And
Uh,
in his 90s, he lost his psychiatry license. They didn't really like to have him licensed as a psychiatrist in his 90s. So
yeah.
he became a nutritionist.
Yeah. Interesting.
And 2 weeks before his death, he stopped seeing patients. And 4 days before his death, he said, I'm not feeling very well. And 2 days before his death, he checked into the local hospital. And he didn't have any diseases as such, but his organs just started to slow down and pack up. No drugs, no pain, at peace, in his 90s, brain functioning all the way. And that's what we're about. Now, the core principle in your ageless brain strategy is supply and demand. And it takes me back to my days studying economics. And I guess the analogy is both the economy and our brain and body are complex, adaptive organisms. We need more income than outgoings, so to speak. You list three essential supplies. Take us through that.
Yeah, and before, if you would just allow me for one moment, Linus Pauling, one of our heroes for many of us, of course, taught for years at Caltech, where I was a student, and Norman Davidson, who was also a professor there, told me years later that he and Linus Pauling would teach chemistry. And what would happen is he would be sitting in the front row waiting for the class to start. And Linus would come strolling past him, not even knowing what he was going to teach that day. And Norman would say to him, today you're supposed to teach X, whatever it is. And he said he would just jump up on the stage and just teach the most beautiful course you could imagine on something that he'd just been told, 1 minute ago. So he was in awe of Pauling's ability to just bring all this together. Just obviously an amazing intellect. So it's exciting to hear that you worked with him.
One
Incredible.
more story from Linus Pauling, because Dr. Abram Hoffer's son, who is professor of medicine at McGill, John Hoffer, was at a conference as a young medic and scientist with Linus Pauling, and it was the break, and they were in the urinals and having a pee. And John said to Linus Pauling, no one's really going to believe us until we have, large-scale placebo-controlled randomized trials, published in peer-reviewed journals. And Linus looked at him and he looked down and he looked back and he said, "Son, we're all peers."
Yeah, interesting. I like it. So let's go back to what you had said about the support. So, and as I mentioned in the book, this really comes about from evolution. As you know, there's this phenomenon called antagonistic pleiotropy, where you select for things that are performance based, but that may, in fact, drag your age. It may support aging in a negative way. And so, similarly, you've got these beautiful systems in your brain, your neuroplasticity, your motor modulation, your power amplification, et cetera. And these systems have been selected over the millennia to be incredibly finely functioning. You can store more in your brain than over 2,000 home computers. It's incredible. But when these are selected, they are selected for performance over durability. Therefore, they are left with Achilles heels. And so you've got this, as you mentioned, you've got this fine, you've got supply, you've got demand. Now, the three big supplies, as you were mentioning, energetics. So you need that blood flow. You need that oxygenation, which is why sleep apnea is such a problem for so many people. You need that mitochondrial function. You need that metabolic flexibility. You need that insulin sensitivity, all that. The second one is trophic support. And so, as you know, you need your neurotrophins, your BDNF, your NGF, things like that. You need your nutrients, B12, folate, vitamin D, all these things. And you need your hormones. You need your thyroid, your estradiol, your testosterone, these things. For a fully functioning brain, these are the major groups of things, the three major groups that will support that remarkably functioning brain.
And of course, you mentioned in your book about blood flow, because it's the flow of the blood that delivers all the nutrients and the oxygen into those billions, maybe trillions of mitochondria in the brain. So that's very important. And that's also part of this sort of vascular dementia, because people get a little bit hung up on, is it vascular or Alzheimer's and so on. And as far as I can see, they kind of have the same drivers anyway. So whatever we do to prevent, and this is the wonderful thing, whatever we do to prevent dementia, Alzheimer's, cognitive decline, we're actually preventing a whole host of 21st century diseases.
Exactly. And I think this has been a real failure in standard of care medicine, where they're not looking at the fact that there's all these so-called non-communicable diseases, whether, as you say, it's Alzheimer's or vascular dementia or ALS or heart failure, what have you. These things that are chronic illnesses associated with aging, doing the right thing, optimizing these and identifying what is driving the process is helpful. And for example, we see people all the time when they go on an optimal protocol. Not only do they do better with their cognition, but they now can throw away their antihypertensives. They don't need them anymore. They can throw away their statins. They don't need those anymore. They can often throw away their anti-diabetes drugs, so they don't have type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes. So as you say, basically you see people getting healthier.
So that's the supply side of thing. I'm sure we'll return to that. Good energy, good supply of nutrients, good function in the brain, and so on. So, what are the three categories that you talk about in your book of demand? What puts a
Yeah.
demand on the brain? What taxes our brains?
Yes. And so, of course, we're using our brains. It requires a tremendous amount of energy as it is, but you tax it further when you create inflammation. So, for example, any sort of chronic infection, metabolic syndrome, chronic sinusitis, changes in the oral microbiome. It's been fascinating to me that the brain has turned out to have its own microbiome. And it turns out that many of the members of the brain microbiome are from the oral microbiome. So it appears that there is some relationship there. There is some sharing at some point. The second one is various toxins, and these come in three different types. It's the inorganics, like air pollution and mercury and things like that. It's the organics, things like benzene and toluene and glyphosate, and now it looks like microplastics are going to be the latest organic, and there's certainly a relationship with cognitive decline. Whether or not it's causal is not as clear yet, but that's the concern. And then the third group is the biotoxins, and I think they're dramatically underappreciated as relatively common causes of cognitive decline. Trichothecene and ochratoxin A and gliotoxin and things like that. So that's the second one, the
Where
second
do we get
driver.
these biotoxins from?
Yeah, it's a great point. So typically you're getting these things from leaky roofs and things like that. So, or you're getting them from a basement that's full of mold. And, we think of mold as like, oh yeah, mold's everywhere. But there are certain molds. It's the classic ones, Stachybotrys, Aspergillus, Penicillium, Chaetomium, Wallemia. Those are the big five. And they are, of course, they're producing toxins because they're trying to live among bacteria. They're trying to hack out their own ecosystem. And unfortunately, they damage us as well as the bacteria, in part because our mitochondria, of course, are descended from bacteria. So these toxins can be quite toxic to us and are clearly associated at times with dementia. So you have to identify those, and you can actually do a simple test in your house to see whether you have these mycotoxins or these specific molds. And you can also check your urine or your blood to see whether you've got these toxins in your urine or whether you've got antibodies to these toxins in your blood. So again, we're getting better and better abilities to look at where things stand and determine why that is. And I want to add one thing really quickly here. Just today, we were going over, every week we go over the various patients at Pacific Neuroscience Institute, and there was one who, looking at the ASL, arterial spin labeling, so this is looking at areas of blood flow throughout the brain. A year ago, the person, when they started to go on the protocol, dramatic reductions, classic for Alzheimer's, not looking good at all. Now they really jumped in and did everything right. Cognition's improved, but the striking thing on the arterial spin labeling, suddenly the blood flow was beautiful and just dramatic improvements. And so you can now see, as you're getting better blood tests, things like p-tau and things like that, we can see that all these things are improving.
And that mold area as well, because it's the black stuff also that you might see in your shower or in damp
Yep.
walls or ceilings, isn't it?
Yes, so the Stachybotrys is probably the worst of them. And that's the one that makes the trichothecenes that are often associated with cognitive decline. So yeah, that's the scary stuff. And it's actually good. People will say, well, you can't get rid of mold. Well, it's actually a good idea. And there are lots of groups that are quite good at inspecting and also at remediating. And there's no question this is a relatively common contributor. It does create inflammation, but it also damages your energetics. So by multiple mechanisms, it brings you down. And then I should mention the third of the drags is a stress. And as a scientist, I used to think that stress, big deal. We're all under stress. But it turns out it's actually quite a bit more important than I had realized years ago. It's fine for acute stress. We're of course made to handle acute stress with resolution. And of course, Selye did so much work in this area, but it's that chronic, unremitting stress that is associated with brain atrophy, associated with high cortisol, associated with hypertension, cardiovascular disease, all these sorts of things. It's a real problem, and it is associated with brain atrophy and cognitive decline. So those are the big three that are on the demand side.
I wrote a book called The Stress Cure and pushed a lot of people in the direction of heart maths. Uh,
Yeah, and
you know,
by the way, we use heart math in our
yeah,
trial.
It's such a nice way. You clip this thing on your ear and you kind of monitor, if you like, your stress state, the heart rate variability. And I think the big learning in heart math was that when we are stressed and anxious, we tend to think we can think our way out of it,
Yeah.
um, but we can't. And what the research of the Heart Math Institute showed is the best way to switch off a stress response is kind of to feel your way out of it. So they have techniques called quick coherence, where you imagine you're breathing into the heart space and learn how to evoke a very positive, emotional, regenerative feeling. And you can literally see, because you can see on your phone that you're coming out of that stress state. I think so many of us have to um, unlearn. So we're plugged in permanently into a state of stress. We have to learn how to get out of that so that our baseline is not this permanent cortisol pumping stress anxiety state.
And I think that's where the wearables, so many things, wearables are really changing chronic illness because they can help us see it coming. Things like continuous glucose monitoring, very helpful. And of course, HRV, which is the reason I brought this up. You've been talking about stress. Looking at monitoring your HRV each day can be very helpful.
And you mentioned earlier about sort of microbes and the mind, and it brought to mind this very recent study on the shingles vaccine, where here in Wales, depending on your age, you either got it or you didn't. And those who got the shingles vaccine, so we're talking about, the herpes family,
Yeah.
seemed to have less risk. The absolute risk reduction was smaller. Obviously, the relative risk is bigger. There's always a bit of a confusion there in people's minds on the statistics. And then we also have the sort of growing evidence of that particular strain of herpes, which is quite commonly found in the brain. So let's just dig a little bit deeper into sort of viral infections that occur in the gut, in the brain, and what we could potentially do about that.
It's a great point. And as you indicated, the herpes family is the one that is probably the most intimately related with cognitive decline. So there's a study out of Taiwan showing that people who treated HSV1 on their lips with outbreaks in their midlife had more than a 50% reduction in their risk of cognitive decline in the future. So HSV1 likely to be very important. And of course, Professor Ruth Itzhaki from the UK has spent her career looking at herpes virus and its relation to cognitive decline. So I think her work is elegant, beautiful stuff, and very convincing. Then there's HHV6A, which is another one which was again identified independently in the brains as associated with cognitive decline. You mentioned shingles, so herpes varicella zoster. That is another one. And then Epstein-Barr virus and CMV have all of those herpes family members have been associated with risk for cognitive decline. And you mentioned the vaccine. It's very interesting. Three different vaccines, BCG, which is used, of course, for tuberculosis in many places around the world, and the varicella zoster, the herpes that you mentioned, the shingles vaccine, and influenza have all been associated with reduced risk, whereas the COVID vaccine is often seen, at least acutely, relatively within months, subacutely, associated with some degree of cognitive decline. And certainly, people who get COVID have an increased risk for developing dementia. But even the people who are getting boosters, we often see that as an initiation of a drop in their cognition. So that it seems to be, if the predominant effect is inflammation, there's a greater chance for cognitive decline. If the predominant effect is to activate to activate the adaptive system, and to clear pathogens and things like that, then you seem to do better over the years. So I think this is, this is a way that, one of the many things that, as you point out, prevention is the key here.
So we've mentioned supply and demand. Let's talk about genes, kicking off with ApoE4. And quoting your book in regards ApoE4, which I believe 1 in 4 people have, and 1 in 50 have the double allele, e.g., they
Right.
inherit it from both parents. So in your book, it says, you say, on average, according to the study, so this is a specific study, The age of symptom onset in ApoE4 was 65 years. Can you eradicate this apparent disadvantage with the right nutrition and lifestyle?
Absolutely. In fact, there's some interesting work showing that one copy of ApoE4, which does raise risk from about 9%. So, as you mentioned, about three-quarters of the population, you have no copies of ApoE4. For example, I check myself, I'm an ApoE33. That's kind of the most common. Single copy, that is a quarter of the population, and that is at a 30% lifetime risk. And two copies, it's about 90%. Most people will get it. That's been worrisome to people, but please don't worry. Get on active prevention. We recommend everyone who's 35 or over get evaluated, get on active prevention. It's pretty easy to do now, and there are now some blood tests, et cetera. Now, what they found in the study that I mentioned was that the risk from one copy of ApoE4 was offset virtually perfectly from regular exercise. So you could basically use that to offset it. There's a wonderful website with over 8,000 people who are ApoE4 positive. It's called apoe4.info, started by Julie G, who's a woman who's ApoE4, two copies, and was actually having some cognitive decline in her late 40s. She's now in her 60s. She's done beautifully. She's continued to address the things that were driving her decline. And she's now, 13 years into doing very, very well. So there's absolutely a way to eradicate that risk, and everyone should do it. The classical claim has been don't bother to check because there's nothing you can do about it. And I think that that's really, as Julie herself says, that's creating false hopelessness.
Yeah, there's that classic soundbite that genes load the gun and the environment pulls the trigger. So
Yeah.
don't pull the trigger.
Yeah.
Now, I wanted to ask you about clinical measures. I mean, I know recently there's this very, very big push going on in the media and in medicine to get that blood biomarker that predicts who's going to get, Alzheimer's in the future. And I usually say, would you like a blood test to test how fit you are? Well, surely I have a fitness test. So it seems
Yeah.
the obvious place to start is actually to have a cognitive function test, such as MOCA or the cognitive function test. Especially since they seem to be very sensitive, really picking up subtle changes very early on. But also blood markers, if you like, of disease progression or regression. And we
Right.
know pharma wants a two-step dance, bit like cholesterol and statins. You have a blood test for amyloid or p-tau.
Yep.
It looks
Yep.
like p-tau 217 is going to be the one. Then you get prescribed a drug. Only an effective one doesn't exist yet.
Yeah.
But are these also important to measure? As a clinician, you also measure GFAP, which many
Yeah.
listeners won't have heard of. If you could run only three tests as clinical measures to see if a person is likely to be improving, what would you test?
If I could do just three to follow them, I would do p-tau 217. And by the way, there's a new one coming out, super p-tau 217, which is much more sensitive, actually. But p-tau 217 has correlated very well. The second one would be GFAP because p-tau 217 tells you whether you have the underlying biochemistry that's going to result in Alzheimer's going on. Please don't worry about it. If yours happens to be high, we can bring them down. One of the things we're doing in our trial is following p-tau 217. So there's no question you can bring these things down by doing the right things. It's yet another measurement. Not only does your cognition improve, but your biomarkers go down. As you mentioned, the second one is GFAP, which is glial fibrillary acidic protein. This is actually looking at inflammation and attempted repair. So good one to know. It's very sensitive. It's not just for Alzheimer's. It will tell you anything causing inflammation in your brain. So if you've got, if you've got some oral microbiome changes, or you recently had an auto accident or things like that, it may be up. The third one, there are two of them, and you could either take NFL, neurofilament light, which is one that tells you whether there's neuronal damage from any cause. So now you've got one astrocytic, one neuronal, and one Alzheimer's specific. Or you could take A beta 42/40 ratio, because that one tells you whether you're early in the process of Alzheimer's. Again, please don't worry. These are things you can address. Now, here's the problem I have with the pharmaceutical industry. What they're doing is pushing this so that you get earlier and earlier, you find this, and then boom, you jump on these drugs that, as you said, are ineffective. They don't make you better. They, in the best case scenario, they slow the decline a little bit. But here's what's interesting. What they've done is move it earlier and earlier and earlier until when you take these early cases, as I mentioned earlier, which are basically now the SCI or the asymptomatic, there are many things that give you better outcomes than the drugs. I have a whole list of them. As an example, extra virgin olive oil alone performed better in these early patients than the drugs. Exercise performed better than the drugs. A comprehensive protocol like what we are doing, which precision medicine protocol, performs far better and actually improves your cognition and sustains the improvement. So the idea of moving this earlier and earlier, I think, is really, you now have to hide the fact that you are doing something that is incredibly easy to do, and you're doing it with horrible side effects just because you're trying to make billions of dollars. That's sad.
Now, just to explain a couple of terms for listeners, p-tau. Tau is a protein which becomes an abnormal, aberrant protein called p-tau. And by the way, raised homocysteine, lack of B vitamins, drives the formation of p-tau. And if you lower homocysteine with B vitamins, it helps to clear the p-tau. And p-tau produces or is very strongly associated with neurofibrillary tangles. Think of all
Right.
the networks of connections. So if the p-tau is high, it's very, very likely you've got this kind of degeneration of connections. And that's why you think it's it's a very important marker. And just one other point for those listeners listening, we've got neurons, which, if you like, are doing the talking. And then you've got these other cells, astrocytes, which sometimes they're called the fueler cells, but they're very important in many respects. They support the neurons. So you're picking a measure of neuronal health and a measure of astrocyte health
Exactly.
within those biomarkers. Is that about right?
That's exactly right. And let me just add one other thing about p-tau because it's so fascinating. This whole field has been in love with pathology for many, many years. And that makes sense. Pathology really emerged as an important science in the 1800s, where people were looking at MS and people were looking at ALS and these various diseases. And then, of course, in 1906, the first description of Alzheimer's disease. But now we're beginning to change from looking at pathology. As you said, these bad proteins, p-tau, bad protein, amyloid, bad protein. Let's look at the physiology, the normal. Why are they there? They're not there to give you a disease. They're there to fight these various infections, toxins. They are responding to these insults. So tau is a particularly fascinating one. Normally, tau is bolting down your microtubules. So it is stabilizing the outgrowths of your brain cells, of your neurons, just as if you would put some bolts on to build an addition to your house. When you now have these insults, when you have reduced blood flow or you have insults from bacteria or viruses or fungi, your p-tau becomes phosphorylated, and especially at site 217, but at multiple other sites. That changes the charge, it changes the shape, and it immediately pops the p-tau off of the microtubules, which now can collapse. So you've switched from connection mode to protection mode, just as I mentioned in the book. And what's interesting is the p-tau now is an antimicrobial protein. Just as amyloid beta is an antimicrobial peptide, this now goes out and fights the various bacteria. So it's a beautiful system. This thing is stabilizing things at one moment, but now you're calling upon it. Okay, we've been invaded. You now got to go out and kill the microbes that are invading our brain. So that's why, and that's what we were picking up in the blood, is this p-tau that is being produced because you're responding to these insults. And the good news, if you fix that, if you get rid of those insults, you now lower your p-tau and you'll see improvements in these biomarkers.
So let's move from pathology to physiology, as you say, and look at biomarkers of risk, as in tests that you can immediately do something about. I think you know at our charity, Food for the Brain, we've developed a pinprick test which enables you to measure homocysteine, the omega-3 index, vitamin D, HbA1c as a measure of glucose balance,
Wow.
and now we've added the glutathione index, which is the ratio
Oh,
of GSH to GSSG. What's your starting point? What are the essentials you need to know about your patients in this respect?
wow, that is a fantastic test. So yeah, congratulations on that. And actually, the best work on homocysteine has come out of the UK. That beautiful study and where, looking at over years the atrophy of the hippocampus and the atrophy of the brain as a whole, uh, based on your homocysteine and showing this amazing relationship as your homocysteine goes up and up and up above 7, and especially, as it was pointed out, above 13, you get more and more rapid brain atrophy, and that just addressing that and bringing it down stops the atrophy. It's a beautiful study. So, congratulations on all that beautiful work. And it's fantastic that you can get all these studies with a finger prick. This is kind of what Dr. Holmes was trying to do here, before she was arrested and incarcerated. It was a wonderful idea. We want to be able to get very simple tests like this. So what we want to look at is very similar. We want to look at, just as we look at the different types, we want to look at what has perturbed that. So anything that is driving inflammation. So we want to know your HSC, CRP, for example. We would like to
Is a
know
measure of inflammation. Yeah.
a measure of inflammation. And of course, homocysteine is another thing that both is on the inflammatory side, but is also on the detox side. How are you methylating things overall? We would like to know where you stand with respect to your energetics. And so are your vessels in good shape? How are you with your LDL particle number? We typically like to use ApoB. It's probably the best simple measure for the different pieces of this together. So we'd like to know where you stand with that. And then, of course, we'd like to know where you have your toxin status. So actually, I'm very interested in your findings on this. Do you find, because we tend to measure total glutathione, and it's often low in people who have biotoxin exposure. Have you found the ratio to be helpful?
Very much. And one of my issues with glutathione is which is perhaps we could say the most important intracellular antioxidant,
Yeah,
is the minute that blood leaves your body, it's oxidizing. So
exactly.
glutathione goes from the reduced state, GSH, to the oxidized state, GSSG. And we've studied that very closely. And I have to say, probably I'm just a little skeptical of quite a lot of studies on glutathione simply because it's such a hard thing to stabilize. And it took us a long time. So you've got this glutathione, which is being used up. Think of it like the water in the fire truck. And then you're producing the oxidized or spent glutathione. There's a very key enzyme, as you know, glutathione reductase,
Yeah.
which is involved in this process. And we know in people with dementia, their glutathione goes down, their oxidized glutathione goes up. The glutathione reductase enzyme GR, it slows down. So in other words, it's like more fires that they're not able to put out fast enough. They're running out of water in the truck. So that's the sort of sequence. So we thought we would look at the ratio between the loaded and the spent. And it's proving very good, but it took us a long time to develop the bit on the card where the blood drop has to hit. It took quite a while to be absolutely stable. And I have to tell you, in the very first batch that we did, even though we had proven that that was stable, we found there was some degradation in the actual dry blood spot card in the process of getting to the person. And we learned that we got to stick that card in a, sealed envelope with a moisture, proof thing.
Yeah.
And they take the card out, do the pinprick, drops on the card, back in that sealed envelope with the moisture thing. So,
Yeah.
and now we have got stability. So I think that we not only have something that is very stable and very practical, but it's better to be able to look at that ratio. And what we're doing now is studying that ratio in relation to things like homocysteine as well.
Yeah.
Because as you know, from the protein we eat, methionine, we make homocysteine. We want to make S-adenosyl methionine that does all the methylation, but also from homocysteine, you can make glutathione itself. If you have the right B vitamins and so on. So yeah, it's a new area, and I'll keep you posted on our research. Just out of interest, what homocysteine are you shooting for in patients? What do you consider to be optimal? What do you consider to be worrying?
Well, I'm just going directly from this beautiful studies out of the UK where they said that people who are below 7 had no increased risk for this decline. And as you started to go 7 and above, so we're shooting for 7 or lower.
Fantastic. Now, let's move on to diet. Your book goes big on a plant-rich, mildly ketogenic diet. You refer to KetoFlex 12-3. Can you elaborate?
Yes. So what has come up again and again, of course, we are a little bit like our brains are like a Prius. There are only two things that are the fuel, and those are glucose and ketones. So you want to have, for best outcomes and for best support, you want to have metabolic flexibility, the ability to go back and forth. And unfortunately, for many of us, we've lost both of those because of insulin resistance associated with a standard Western diet. We now can't use glucose optimally. And because of the high insulin associated with insulin resistance, it prevents you from making the ketones. So you're really sputtering when I see people with cognitive decline, I consider that an emergency. They're coming in because their brains are simply not able to function normally. And so we want to bring both of those back. We want to make it so that you have enough ketone and you're able to generate ketone. So in the short run, we often will just give some exogenous ketones. And then we want to get you to be insulin sensitive. Now, there's lots of diets that people have used. The one that has worked the best overall is just what you said, a plant-rich, not plant only, but plant-rich, mildly ketogenic diet, which is high in phytonutrients, which is high in fiber, and which is taken over anywhere from 8 to 12 hours during the day. So you have a period at night where your brain is cleansing itself literally. And if you are metabolically flexible, you're able to go into ketosis when you need that. If you're not, of course, you're unable to go into ketosis when you need it, and you're really in trouble because you now don't have the glucose or the ketones. We call it KetoFlex 12-3 because it's ketogenic, it's metabolically flexible. It's 12 hours of fast at night. So if you finish dinner, for example, at 8 p.m., you should not eat before 8 a.m. You want to have that time to create some autophagy, to create some brain cleansing. And it's 3 hours before bed. If you're going to finish if you're going to go to bed at 10, you shouldn't eat after 7 p.m. just because you don't want to keep your insulin high at night while you're sleeping. That degrades optimal sleeping. So that's why we use that particular diet, and it's actually worked quite well for many people.
And included in your diet is fish, and there's quite an emphasis on oily fish, but there's also this subject of mercury. And I have to tell you, some years ago, I was researching the ratio of DHA, omega-3 DHA, which is the
Yeah.
most important brain
Yeah.
building fatty acid, and mercury. And I was very confused because the American mackerel seemed to have a lot more mercury than the English coastal reports of mackerel, and I couldn't work it out. And that got me into looking at species of mackerel. And I realized that there is a very large, Americans like things bigger,
Right.
a
Yeah.
very large mackerel
Yeah.
off the American coast, a
Yeah.
king mackerel.
King mackerel, that's the problem. Yeah, we
Yeah,
always
which
say
has a lot more
don't eat the king
mercury than
mackerel. Yeah.
our little tiny little shiny mackerel that swim around the Great British Isles. And so it was a question of size. So is that really the issue that we want to eat oily fish? And oily fish, by the way, are cold water fish that have eaten fish, so they're higher up the food chain. But we don't want the really big ones because they could accumulate too much mercury.
Right, we do. Yeah, exactly. We don't want the long-lived, large-mouthed fish. We don't want the tuna. We don't want the shark. We don't want the swordfish. And of course, now we've got to worry about microplastics, unfortunately, because they're in many of these fish. But in general, we suggest wild-caught smash fish. That's the salmon, mackerel, not king mackerel, anchovies, sardines, and herring. So those are the classic ones that give you those. And then, of course, also pastured chicken, not CAFO chicken, not chicken that's brought up, with one of these industrial farms. So, pastured chicken, pastured eggs, grass-fed beef, all of those things are wonderful. And of course, with a large amount of vegetable, especially especially the non-starchy vegetables. So, as far better than I, these diets can be so incredibly important for health, for heart disease, for brain disease, for all these things. And it's amazing, Patrick, when we see these people who come back after a couple of months and they're just different people. They're so much sharper. They'll come. One lady came and she was kind of at the beginning looking out the window, really couldn't kind of keep with the conversation. She came back after a couple of months. She slapped me on the leg, said, "Hey, doc, I'm doing much better." That the most common thing I hear from the families is they're so much more engaged. So this makes a huge difference.
You also talk about some key nutrients, magnesium, zinc, for example, coenzyme Q. I've been getting very interested in the fully loaded CoQ, ubiquinol.
Mhm.
Put some emphasis on those in the book. Do you think it's important that people later in life are supplementing antioxidants, minerals like magnesium and zinc?
It's a great point. And in general, most of us are deficient in zinc. It's been estimated that there are 1 billion people on Earth who are deficient in zinc. You mentioned magnesium as well. Choline is another common one. Iodine is another common one, and potassium often. And these are all associated when they are deficient, and vitamin D would be another one you could add. All when they are deficient are associated with increased risk for cognitive decline. So I do think it's helpful. And we just had a few recently, people who were on the protocol as part of our ongoing trial. They finished the time in the trial and they just said, "I'm just going to stop all the supplements." And they actually had some backpedaling. So, unfortunately, you really do want to optimize, especially when someone actually has some degree of cognitive decline already. The great news is the armamentarium is large and growing for what we can do, and absolutely nutrients play an important role.
So let's talk about drugs. There's a whole media hype about the big breakthrough in the first effective drugs, actually anti-amyloid injections. What's your take on this?
My take on it is this is much more about business than it is about medicine. Because when you say breakthrough, they're not breakthroughs. What they do is, at the best, they will slow the decline by about 25 to 30%. As has been pointed out, this is not clinically significant. They don't make you better. And that's the most important thing to recognize. These drugs do not make you better. What they do is they slow the decline. And I would urge everyone to read a wonderful book called Doctored by Charles Piller. He's a writer for an excellent journal called Science. And he talks about how these were developed. He talks about all the chicanery and subterfuge that went on with testing, with the various kind of under the table goings on, how they were pushed through the FDA, and how groups were like Medicare have been pushed to pay for them, even though they are absurdly expensive. And again, they're really more about business and profit than they are about helping people with cognitive decline.
It is a shocking book, and he makes it clear that we've got about 1 in 200 people in these clinical trials have died, but the way they die is really scary. I think the first report, the doctor said it was literally like her brain exploded.
Yeah, that was very sad to see. Well, and you can see you're producing this amyloid because you are dealing with these various insults, the various bacteria, the various mold species, et cetera. These are antimicrobial peptides, and they are setting up, they are much, it's interesting, it's a barrier function, much like your cerumen or much like your skin. These are things that have an antimicrobial barrier function. The reason for that barrier is to allow the rest of your brain to work very well. And in fact, it does very well. You can go decades with amyloid in your brain and still have a very highly functional brain until you get some degree of inflammation. And that's when you take that next step beyond the barrier. And now you do have compromise. But the thing is that these things, when you're now ripping, you're now giving an antibody and a relatively large dose of antibodies that will seek out and literally rip this stuff out of your brain and unfortunately rip it out of your blood vessels. Well, what do you think is going to happen? The blood vessels then leak. And so you have microhemorrhages, you have brain swelling, and as you indicated, sometimes you have death from these things. So I think that this is I really think this is a misguided approach. We understand much better now what's driving the problem and therefore what to do about it. These things were developed based on a 1990s view of what was hurting your brain, with the idea being that amyloid caused Alzheimer's. It's not the cause of Alzheimer's, it's a response to these various insults that we suffer. So I think that these are kind of outdated drugs that were really meant to target something 30 years ago, and it just took a long time to get to the clinic. And so, unfortunately, people don't want to give up on them. But the reality is, these are not appropriate drugs, and he goes into that in the book very clearly. So it's really, unfortunately, a suboptimal approach to the disease.
Yeah, that's the first chapter in my book, Amyloid Does Not Equal Alzheimer's. And what I didn't realize, I mean, the whole story really happened because there's this tiny, considerably less than 1% of people who get the amyloid protein precursor gene, APP. So
Yes.
that is kind of causative as such. But what I didn't realize is that two of these anti-amyloid medications had been trialed against in people with this very rare genetic causative amyloid protein precursor gene, who, by the way, still make big improvements on your kind of strategy. And it didn't work. In one, the cognition stayed the same. In the other, it got worse. And of course, they all had a lot of side effects. So if the medication doesn't work in the people who have the amyloid, protein precursor gene, how on earth is it going to work on the people who don't? But of course, the hot seller right now are the seemingly miraculous
Yeah.
GLP-1 agonist drugs such as Ozempic and Wegovy. Are these going to play a role in Alzheimer's prevention, do you think?
That's such a good question. And I think it's early days. We don't know yet, but they may. So my argument would be you can get a better outcome if you can do the appropriate diet, appropriate exercise, sleep, stress, all these sorts of things. You will get a better, healthier outcome. But for those people who say, I can't do that, I just want to give me a drug that will help me to lose some weight and to get more insulin, to make more insulin myself, then yes, you could use these. So I would recommend people think about using it for 3 to 6 months to the point where you now are able to make more insulin. But be careful, you can throw yourself into insulin resistance over time. Of course, the other thing is you lose a lot of muscle mass often on these drugs. Some people also get gastroparesis. They can, vomit and things like that. So that's not so great either. But for some people, and again, transiently especially, to get rid of the cravings for food, to bring down the weight, it's actually not an unreasonable thing. At least it makes some sense. The problem, as far as physiology, as you know, you're taking a process that's meant to last seconds to minutes, and now you're making it last for days, weeks, and months. And so it's a non-physiological approach, and I think it's always a little bit worrisome to try to trick Mother Nature, because that tends not to go very well. But for some people, I do think the GLP-1s could be helpful.
So the seven basics in your book are diet, exercise, sleep, de-stressing, brain training. We haven't had a chance to talk a lot about that, but really, use it or lose it. Detox processes, targeted supplements. And
Yes.
you've said that, that's the core, but for some, it's not the whole story. And we then spoke more about some of these brain toxins, molds, for example, microbes, etc. So, we all have a brain. If you want to have yours for a very long time, I do strongly recommend you read The Ageless Brain. Also read my book, Alzheimer's Prevention is the Cure. Get yourself educated and get started young. I think, do you know, the biggest thing that makes me sad is that people say, I don't want to do the cognitive function test. And
Yeah.
you've helped us to create Alzheimer's Prevention Day,
Yeah.
which is on May the 20th. And you helped us create the website alzheimersprevention.info, which has a 3-minute test, very, very simple that you can do. And people say, I
Simple.
don't want to do it because I don't want to know. And I say, well, why don't you want to know? They said, because there's nothing you can do about it. And that
Oh,
is
yeah.
really the big paradigm shift we want to change, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think it's fantastic that you wrote the book, loved the book. Imagine that you have people that are for hundreds and hundreds of years are driving through stop signs, not realizing that you just have to stop at the stop sign. And there you go. So you're getting crashes, and people are saying, we don't know why another person died because they crashed into this person. We just don't know why this is happening. And then you come out and say, look, just when you see that stop sign, stop. This is where we stand with cognitive decline. You don't have to do all these things that are killing people. You don't have to have insulin resistance. You don't have to be living with mycotoxins. You don't have to be doing all these things. We now know what to look for. We now know what to do about it. As you mentioned, some simple 3 minutes to do cognitive assessment. You can do the blood drop that you mentioned and look at these critical parameters. Nobody should be getting. That's the point of this book. It should save synapses for everybody. Cognitive decline should be a rare condition. And unfortunately, it is now the number one killer of women in the UK and the number two killer overall in the UK. Incredibly common. We can make it much, much less common.
And I'm glad you mentioned women because my next podcast with Dr. Louise Newson is called Women's Brains Matter. And we're going to go deeply into the subject of hormones, which you also cover in your book, but we haven't had a chance to cover here. So I want to end by getting a website or two from you as to where people can go to get more information. The book is The Ageless Brain, and it's published all over the world. So obviously you can get it easily on Amazon. But what's your website, and how can people go a little bit more deeply into what you're offering in terms of, clinical possibilities, education, and so on?
Yeah, absolutely. There are lots of ways you can go. So you can go on Facebook, Dr. Dale Bredesen. You can go on Instagram, Dr. Dale Bredesen. You can go on X. You can go on Blue Sky. All of those things. You can also freely available online are published papers from our group. You can look at papers from the clinical trial. You can look at papers for reversal of cognitive decline. We were the first to publish reversal of cognitive decline in Alzheimer's disease way back in 2014. So there's a lot of ways to get information. And I encourage everyone, get the cognitive tests because there is something you can do about it.
Your friend and mine, also brilliant neurologist and also part of our group. Don't forget alzheimersprevention.info, Alzheimer's Prevention Day, May the 20th. Dr. David Perlmutter, he gave me a wonderful quote. Becoming an Alzheimer's patient is almost always a choice.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it.
So our books are there to make sure that you don't make the wrong choices and keep your brain super healthy. Dr. Dale Bredesen, thank you very much for sharing your wisdom and pioneering this whole new territory and bravely spreading the word and spreading hope because we do now know what we need to do to have an ageless brain.
Thank you, Patrick.